Good morning. We're going to give it just a second. It always takes just a minute or two to allow everyone the opportunity to roll in. So while it's letting people in, we'll give it just a second. All right, let's get started. Hello and welcome to today's Wyoming Community Navigator Program webinar. My name is Mandy Bailey. I'm the Advising and Education Director, and I'm going to be here working behind the scenes with any technical difficulties that may arise and facilitating as best I can. So make sure you monitor the Q&A, the chat, post any questions you have in either of those two, and we'll respond as quickly as possible. We also will be putting helpful links in there and other information. So monitor the chat as best as you can. Just to give you a little bit of information about the Wyoming Community Navigator Program. The Wyoming Community Navigator Program is funded by the U.S. Small Business Administration, and it utilizes the Wyoming Entrepreneurial Support Network to reduce barriers that all small businesses often face, including those owned by veterans, women, groups such as rural communities and communities of color. So we do this using a hub and spoke model. Our hub and our spokes provide training, access to capital, and access to other resources to help small business owners build resiliency and ultimately be the driving force behind Wyoming's economic recovery. Today, we are going to be discussing Microsoft Teams 101, and we have our presenters with us, Daniel Patterson and Bridget Manley. And so I am going to give you a brief bio on them, and they might want to introduce themselves further later on. But Bridget is an e-learning specialist with a passion for helping learners become effective agents in their careers and in their communities. She co-founded Ascendant Design and Training with her husband, Daniel Patterson, in July of 2020, which I'm sure was an awkward time to start that, but here they are, so they thrived. Before that, she was the curriculum manager for a Denver-based startup company where they developed compliance and manufacturing training for the state legal cannabis industry. And Daniel is a software systems developer with over 30 years of multidisciplinary experience in software, electronic, and mechanical design. He's been very involved in several different industries, including logistics, gaming, music, and heavy equipment, just to name a few. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to both Bridget and Daniel.
Okay, well, thank you, Mandy. We appreciate that as always. I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen so you can see our slides today. We're going to be sharing some tips on how to, basically evaluate Microsoft Teams and to consider whether or not it'd be a good addition to your workflow. Thank you again for joining us today. I know that probably the weather is getting warmer out there in Wyoming, so this is a great day to go out and play, but I appreciate you've chosen to spend the time with us today. And we hope this session will be valuable for you. We wanted to start out just kind of like emphasizing that this isn't a full course on how to use Microsoft Teams. There are many features, many integrations, and that would literally take multiple sessions. What we're aiming to do instead today is give you a high-level overview of its key features, as well as some of the pros and cons for using it in a small business setting. So you can decide if you want to, consider implementing it in your organization. Now, that being said, if you're already using Microsoft Teams and you came today with some specific questions, we'll be happy to address those today as best that we can for you. Okay, so just a little bit more about us. I'm Bridget Manley. I'm the Vice President, Chief Learning Officer here at Ascendant Design and Training. I'm kind of the head of the services side of the house, so I'm working a lot with clients, typically to help them develop learning experiences for employees to help people do their jobs better. Daniel is our Chief Technical Advisor and software guru, and he's kind of on this he's head of the product side of the house, so he does a lot of product development for tools, both for us and for customers as well. Our company is a Microsoft partner. And basically, what that means is that we're providers of products and services related to Microsoft. And specifically, we provide software training on Microsoft products. We don't get kickbacks or any kind of monetary reward from Microsoft. So that just kind of gives you an idea of kind of like where we're coming from today. So let's talk about what we'll do today. Today in this interactive webinar, we'll start by exploring the key features of Microsoft Teams. And then from there, we'll look at we'll look at some main reasons why organizations choose to use Microsoft Teams, kind of look at some general use cases. And then finally, we'll look at the pros and cons of using Microsoft Teams for a small business, so you can decide if it's something you want to explore more. Throughout this session today, we really encourage you to interact with us, basically through the chat. We'll pause throughout the session too to take questions. So during those times, you're more than welcome to unmute your microphone and ask a question. We just ask that when you're not speaking to go ahead and leave your microphone muted so we don't have any background noise. And we'll also have a Q&A at the end as well. So with that, we'd like to start with a discussion question. We'd like to know one of two things. One, if you're already using Microsoft Teams, what's been your experience so far? Have you found any pain points? Is there anything that you particularly like or would like to learn more about? Or if you're not using Microsoft Teams now, we'd like to know kind of what brought you to today's session. Do you have any specific questions or thoughts that you'd like to get more information on? Go ahead and use the chat to answer those questions. You can also unmute your microphone as well if you wanted to just shout it out. Either way is fine. And I'll give you just a minute to think about that. While you're thinking about your answer, I'll just give you a little bit of background, with our experience in Teams. As Mandy mentioned, we started our business during the pandemic, which was interesting. And around that time, we also started using Microsoft Teams for our business. So we've been using it for about 2 years now. We use it primarily for internal communication and organization. But we've also created training for one particular client who used Teams to manage a hybrid workforce that was spread across multiple states. So we went in there, we kind of looked at their configuration, we gave them some tips on how to use it more effectively. And then we went through and actually developed a training program that would help people understand and use those features better, specifically for that type of organization. So we're not Teams experts by any means, but we've had, a fair amount of experience in the trenches with using it. So with that, Daniel, I'll turn it over to you. Just kind of tell us, basically a little bit about who's here today and what their questions might be.
So far, we have nothing in the chat, so I think it's probably clear to continue.
Okay, cool. Okay, so in this first section, we're going to give you that 10,000-foot overview of Microsoft Teams, kind of what it is and what you can do with it. So really basic question, what exactly is Microsoft Teams? There are many different features or, some core functionalities built into the platform, and we'll look at kind of the core 4. The first one is collaboration. Teams is definitely designed to be a collaborative platform so that you're working on files with your team members at the same time in real time. It's also a communication hub. There's lots of different ways integrated throughout the platform where you can communicate with team members either through chat, channel posts, video calls, and phone calls in some cases. We'll kind of dive a little bit more into each of those, specifically channel posts and chat in a little bit. But just suffice it to say, the platform gives you lots of options for how you'd like to communicate with folks in your organization. It's also a tool for resource management. It basically creates a way for you to organize files so that they're easily accessible to the people who need them. In fact, the organization structure is kind of fluid, so you can kind of set up your team's configuration in a way that makes sense for you and your organization. And then the final kind of main functionality is it's the centralized workspace that Teams provide. Depending on how you use it, you can make it a one-stop shop for all work that happens in your organizations. People can access files, communicate with partners, and plan and schedule meetings all right from Teams. So conceivably, Teams might be the only app you really work in throughout the day. Now, of course, that's also going to depend on what kind of other third-party integrations that you use with Teams. So for example, if you have some kind of project management software outside of Teams that may not integrate directly into Teams, you might be bouncing from that to Teams and back and forth. But if you're relying primarily on Microsoft tools, you could probably use your Teams as a one-stop shop for everything. Okay, so now that we have an idea of what it is, let's take a little look at some of the key features that you use, basically when using it. So on the screen here, I have a small screenshot of the user interface of Microsoft Teams. We have the Teams panel open, so you can see that there's a team called Training, and then there's a channel underneath that called General, and then it shows right now the view of a OneNote notebook integrated into that channel. Now, this is a small screenshot, and you'll see why, because we're actually going to kind of blow out some areas that are really important to use in this interface. The first one to be aware of is the teams and channels. These are the base organizational units for Teams as a, for Microsoft Teams as a general rule. Now, this is where it gets confusing. You have Microsoft Teams, the platform, and then you have Teams, this organizational unit. So I'm going to try my best to use Microsoft Teams to talk about the platform and Teams to talk about this organizational unit. So as you can imagine, this gets a little bit confusing. This is kind of one of the things people say when they don't, this is one of the things that people call out in kind of one of its, downfalls, but that's something to keep in mind, is that Teams can mean two different things depending on the context. Okay, so the base organizational unit is the team. In larger organizations, they often use Teams to create a separate team for each department or business unit. And then within those teams, you have another unit you have another unit of organization called the channel. And this is where a lot of the work happens in Microsoft Teams. Each channel basically acts as its own host for its own separate files, notebooks, applications, anything you want to pin in there for easy access. Each team does have a general channel by default. I've seen people use this in various ways. Sometimes people kind of use it as like that catch-all drawer in your kitchen where you can't find a place for anything else. It goes in the general channel, but you can also find other uses for that as well. Each channel has a wall where you can post conversations that are visible to all members of this channel. And this is a nice feature for working out loud. And we'll talk about that later, what that means and why it could be advantageous. Channels can also be based on topics, functions, projects, kind of whatever criteria you want to make for it. And this is kind of where it's one of those things where it can be a bug or a feature, right? If you know exactly how you want to structure your organization, you can make these channels be anything you want. But if you're not quite sure how you want to use it yet, it doesn't give you a lot of guide rails really in how to set those channels up. It's kind of up to you. I'll give you an example of how we use Teams to kind of, or how we use Microsoft Teams to kind of give you an, to give you an idea of how you can configure it. We have basically, since we do a lot of service work, we have a separate team for each client. And then within those teams, we have separate channels for each project. So it's just really easy to pop into the channel and find everything we need, whether it's files or conversations, whatever. And then we use the general channel for the client's team to store things that relate to basically the client generally. So that would be statements of work, invoices, branding guidelines, things like that. And of course, that's just one example. You can find a lot of different ways that you can configure your own Microsoft, or that you can configure your own Microsoft Teams setup. Okay, so the next thing to be mindful of is the side rail. And this is a really easy way to get to all the apps that you use most frequently in Microsoft Teams. The way it's set up automatically is you have some basic apps, including activity. That's the one at the very top with the little bell that gives you basically a log of all recent notifications. You have the chat, and that's where you can have private conversations with one or more people. The calendar syncs with your Microsoft Outlook calendar, so you can see all your appointments from there. And you can also schedule virtual meetings from that calendar. Calls, you can make calls internally to people within your organization, or if you pay an additional fee, you can also make and receive calls from outside parties. Of course, files, that shows recent files that you've used. And then apps, that allows you to add additional apps here, whether it's from Microsoft or from some third-party integration. And this rail is customizable, so you can kind of, change it up based on what you use. The next feature to be mindful of is the search feature. And this is really nice because even when you're doing your best, sometimes it's easy to lose stuff in Teams. The search makes it really easy to search across the entire platform for files, people, chat messages, channel posts, everything you can think of. And then finally, throughout the user interface, there's the Meet button built in throughout. So from wherever you're at, it's really easy to schedule or have a impromptu video meeting with anybody in your organization. Okay. Do we have any questions or thoughts so far, Dan?
No, chat is clear.
Okay. Okay. If you do have any questions or anything, or if I'm going too fast, feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll circle back around. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the Microsoft integrations you can use with Microsoft Teams. One of the advantages of Microsoft Teams is that it really does integrate very well with all other applications in the Microsoft 365 for Business system. Here are some of the integrations you can use, and these are just examples. You can maintain a wiki for a channel right in Microsoft Teams. If you're not familiar, basically a wiki is a documentation website that allows viewers to make contributions and corrections to the content. So it's basically like a living document, and it's used oftentimes to gather documentation or to gather records of a project. You can create a company intranet site using SharePoint. An intranet versus an internet, that's basically an internal facing website that's private to your organization. So you can use that to share files, post company news, make resources available, basically make a small website just for your organization. You can organize data using Microsoft lists. This is kind of a cross between Microsoft Excel and Microsoft Access Database. It's more robust than Excel, but it's not as complex as Access. You can also track tasks in Planner, which is a Microsoft project management tool. You can curate videos in Microsoft Stream, which is basically Microsoft's answer to YouTube. I've seen from training perspectives, people using this to have employees record a short video on, for example, like the best way to, do a task in the office, and then sharing that with other people as a way of kind of creating like that social collaborative environment where people are sharing tips and best practices. But that's just one way that you could use that. You can gather information using Microsoft Forms and embed it straight into Teams. And probably one of the more popular ones, you can maintain client or project notes in OneNote and then pin that notebook in the channel that it relates to. So it's easy right there for, basically anytime you need it, it's right there. And Microsoft Teams does also include a fair amount of customization. So you can make it work best for you and your organization. And here's just a few of them. You can customize your notification settings, which is huge, because depending on how many people are in your organization and how active they are, you can get bombarded with notifications all the time. Fortunately, Microsoft allows you to customize this, so you can determine how many notifications you want and for what activity. So on the slide here, I have a screenshot of the settings page in Microsoft Teams, and it's open to the notifications tab. And as you can see, you can set notifications for basically all activity. You can just get notifications on mentions and replies, or when someone's trying to, basically communicate to you directly, or you can customize it even further. There's also, options for how you want to get notifications in chats and meetings and calls. This is one of the things that I recommend people customizing first in Microsoft Teams, just to make sure that it's going to work for them and it's not going to flood them with notifications. You can set your availability status as well, which is nice if you're working in an organization, or especially a hybrid or remote work organization, and people can't, just peer into your office to see if you're there and available. This is a nice way to let people know, like, hey, I'm head down at work, or hey, I'm open to questions. So this is a nice feature to include too, especially for remote work. You can pin the channels that you use most often, so that they're really easy to access on that side rail. You can add third-party apps that you use often. So you can, again, integrate those applications straight into Microsoft Teams. Now, not all of them integrate perfectly, so that's something to keep in mind. But for the ones that really do integrate well, this is a nice feature to have. You can customize the theme color too. Not a whole lot of options, but this is basically more of an accessibility feature. So if you have, for example, color blindness, there's a specific theme view that has high contrast colors, so you can see the user interface better. And you can pop out the chat into a separate window. It kind of sounds like a simple thing, but that's one of the features I use most often because I'm in chat a lot. And it's nice to just pull it out and have it on the side, not have to have the whole Teams interface open at the same time. So those are kind of the key features and customizations. I'll hand it over to Daniel to see if we have any thoughts or questions.
Yeah, chat is still clear.
I have a question, Bridget.
Okay.
Sure.
What are some of those? Do you happen to know some of the common third-party apps that do integrate well?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Like, I know that we use ClickUp a lot. We've tried integrating it. It's not great, to be honest. I know Jira, I think that one has a direct integration. And Daniel, you might be able to speak more to that. I'm kind of familiar, but okay. So yeah, Jira might be one. Trying to think of some of the others. I know that they have polling applications in there as well. So you can ask people a question like, hey, what's the best time to meet? That works pretty well. Are there any others that you can think of, Dan?
Yeah, just reading from a quick question on Bing. It tells me that they have third-party integrations from Zoom, Cisco, WebEx, Freehand, Dialpad, 3CX, Mail Clark, and many more. So having looked into the third-party apps like ClickUp and things like that when we were getting ours set up, I know that there are literally thousands of different companies who are providing third-party apps, and a lot of the really popular ones will be in the list of possible plugins that you can use. But like Bridget mentioned, sometimes those particular integrations might not exactly be as functional as the native program by that third party. So you'll want to usually use the free trial period if they give you one.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. Yeah, to just kind of, test it first on a free trial and see how it's going to integrate. But that's a good question, Mandy. Thank you.
And is it a cumbersome process to integrate a third-party app into Microsoft Teams?
It's pretty simple. I mean, from the times that I've tried it, you just go and you find, basically find the app in the app list, and it'll give you, basically a quick overview of, what things it'll do. And then you just click a button and usually it'll integrate right away. Dan, correct me if correct me if you've had different experience.
That's the typical process. And if it's something that requires a sign up, like you have a certain login or something that you're going to use with your channel, then you'll put in the username and password somewhere in that a couple of step process, and then it'll be up and running until you pull it off.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions?
None that I'm seeing. I think we're good.
All right, cool. So we'll head into the next section. And this gives you some use cases and how different organizations use Microsoft Teams. The first one is one that we've mentioned before, working out loud. And that's basically a process where you get people to share ideas and information in a very free form and generous way to accomplish, basically to accomplish a variety of different business goals. And we'll go over those in just a second, but just to kind of give you an idea of how that looks like in Teams. You can share and capture institutional knowledge primarily when people are posting to those channels in the channel posts. Basically, as you'll remember, those channel posts are visible to anybody in that channel. So it's a nice way of sharing what you've known or sharing what you've learned with everybody else in your team. The nice thing about this is that it basically keeps a record of all that information. So if you have somebody who's just new to your team and is just starting, they can go back into that post list and they can see everything that's been shared for basically forever. It gives them a really good idea of, everything from best practices and best tips to where a project is right now. It's a really nice way to capture information that doesn't require a ton of work. It's also a great way for people to model their mental processes. And what I mean by that is good work. You only see a little bit of that when you're just watching somebody. A lot of good work happens in somebody's mind where you don't actually see what's happening. So working out loud is a way for people to not only share what they've learned, but to describe what they're thinking of when they're doing a task. And this is really helpful. This is something that I do specifically, as an instructional designer, is to try to get people to share with me, what are you thinking when you're doing this task? And of course, you can do the same thing, unlike in Microsoft Teams, where you're asking people to share what they're thinking as they're working. It's a great way to invite feedback, to put something up and say, hey, I'm stuck on this. I need some feedback. Does this work? It's a great way to get that immediate feedback so people aren't spinning their wheels and getting lost in a project. They can get that feedback and get right back on the road. It's also a great way to strengthen work teams simply because, again, you're sharing generously the ideas that you have, you're building camaraderie, you're building trust. That's one of the big things too about working out loud is that you're sharing that information and you're helping break down silos and also breaking down a culture of knowledge hoarding where people feel like they, have to basically hold on to what they know because that gives them power, right? That doesn't always work well, unlike in a work situation. So working out loud is a good way to kind of, counteract that as well. Another reason why people use Microsoft Teams is to maintain remote and hybrid work teams. And as you can imagine, this has really become an issue or really become kind of a top of mind issue since the pandemic. Because Microsoft is a cloud-based system that works on all or at least most major operating systems, it's really easy for people to access and use regardless of where they're at. It also has full functionality available on the mobile app. And by full functionality, I mean basically all the features that you have in the desktop app, you have in the mobile app. So you can, basically share a chat, you can start a video, you can access files, all those things you can do from the road, which is really nice. Basically, if you have people who are out on the road a lot or out from the office, they get the same value out of it as people who are in the office all the time. So because of that, it's a really good platform also, excuse me, also for distributed teams. And this is just a way, for people to stay all on the same page, to share ideas and to collaborate together. Another basic use case is file sharing. With Microsoft Teams, collaborators can edit a document simultaneously and see the changes right away. So this makes it really nice. For instance, if you're collaborating on a work document and everybody's trying to get their thoughts in at the same time, you can do that without having tons of synchronization errors, which is nice. Sometimes you have a few when people are trying to edit the same thing at the same time, but clearing those, errors is actually pretty easy to resolve most of the time. You can also see and review changes, leave comments, and use track changes to make it very transparent about what changes you're making, which is also like a really great feature to have when you're doing collaborative document editing. Teams also makes it really easy to share documents in a chat, to share them in a channel post, and to share them basically anywhere else using a link. So it's really easy to post a link into a chat and say, hey, can you review this document? And then somebody doesn't have to go into the files and say, which document are you looking for? It's right there, easy to access. You can also share project-related documents and training materials. So again, I mean, from an instructional designer standpoint, I'm constantly thinking about how is it easy to get these materials out to people to where they'll actually use them. And Microsoft Teams is a great solution for that because you can put a training document, again, right in that channel, pin it to the channel. It's right there, easy to get when people need it. And finally, because Microsoft Teams allows you to synchronize shared files to computers, it has a nice kind of built-in backup feature. Worst case scenario, say your internet goes out, basically if you're synchronizing those files to your computer and you have them to where they're always available on your computer, you can keep working. And then when the internet comes back on, you can synchronize your changes with the master basically in Teams, so that way you don't lose any work. All right. Do we have any questions or thoughts in the chat?
No, chat is still clear.
Okay. All right, cool. So we'll go into the final part here, where we'll kind of talk about some of the pros and cons of using Microsoft, using Microsoft Teams specifically. I know some people really love it, some people struggle with it. So we're going to talk about all the stuff, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and hopefully that'll give you some ideas of, what's going to work for you and kind of what the trade-offs might be, basically, if you do want to use Microsoft Teams. So let's start with some of the disadvantages. The first one is it's really kind of primed for Microsoft first users. So this is great news if you use Microsoft on a regular basis. If you don't, though, it's going to be a little bit of a heavier lift to make Microsoft Teams work for you. Basically, like we said before, all the Microsoft apps integrate really well into Teams. But if you're using third-party integrations, sometimes it's hit and miss. Sometimes it does great, sometimes not so much. So you have to, so you have to kind of keep that in mind. What types of applications do you use in your business, and will they integrate well? We kind of mentioned this earlier, but Microsoft does kind of have a free-form kind of lack of structure in how you set it up. There aren't really a whole lot of, guardrails in terms of, what should I make a channel? Well, anything to be a channel. Okay, that's great to know. But it can also be a little bit paralyzing if you don't know how you want to use channels yet. So for that, I would really recommend, basically putting in some time to think about, think about how you want to set it up, how people in your organization work, and what's going to work best for your team. With that, sometimes Microsoft Teams does have a steeper learning curve, and that's because it has such a wide range of features and capabilities, which can make it actually complex to navigate and use effectively. And this complexity can lead to that steeper learning curve, especially for new users who are not familiar with any Microsoft products, and who might be a little bit intimidated by using it in their workflow. Another thing that I've found too, just working with businesses who are using Teams, is sometimes people get distracted by all the apps they could use. It's like, oh, hey, look, Power BI, that's cool. And it's like, yes, but you need to focus on using Excel because that's what that's basically what the team is using. So that's another part too, is sometimes people can get really attracted by all the bells and whistles and, either go off into a bunny trail, or they can get super overwhelmed and say, I don't want to deal with it. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Along with that, sometimes people in Microsoft Teams do have, basic information overload. There's so much information in Teams, it can be hard for them to filter out what's relevant for them, what they need to pay attention to. And this is where setting up your teams and channels can help if you're very specific and granular about what each channel is for. That should help narrow it down a little bit. So again, like in our configuration, we have one channel for each project. So I know that anything I need for that project will be in that channel, but I don't have to be overwhelmed by everything because it's very granular. Along with that, sometimes people aren't a big fan of all the notifications you can get. They find it distracting. They find it derailing. Again, like you can customize your notification settings, but sometimes it takes a little bit of time and tweaking to figure out the right mix to where you're getting notified just enough so you're not missing important things, but you're not getting constantly distracted either. I mean, to be clear, that's not only for Microsoft Teams. You can get that in basically any collaborative platform, but that is one of the things that people do mention when they talk about why they don't want to use Teams. And as I mentioned before, sometimes there are integration challenges with third-party applications. Okay. The final one on this one is security concerns. Simply because Microsoft Teams is a cloud-based platform, there might be some security concerns related to data privacy and protection. Some organizations might feel a little bit nervous about using a cloud-based platform. So I guess my tip for that would be, like, organizations should make sure that they have, basically all their sensitive information stored securely, and that access controls are in place to prevent unauthorized access. Okay, so there's all kind of the disadvantages or some of the, basically some of the common reasons why people aren't the biggest fan of Microsoft Teams. But on the other side, there are some advantages to using the platform as well. I would say probably the main advantage would be it puts, basically it maximizes the context of all the critical information that you're using. And by that, I mean that you can have documents and files and conversations in context of the work itself. So it makes it easier to understand, like, okay, we've got this project. Why are we doing this again? What's the next step? It's all contextualized within those conversations. It makes it much easier to make sense of your work in that way. And here are some ways that it does that. Like the first is having tabs in channels, makes it, again, very easy to access anything you need from that channel. As well as pinning channels or documents as well. So you can make the things that are most important to you very easy to find, very front and center. Or, suppose that you're a manager, you can pin important documents right in the channel so that people can see that front and center as well. Comments too. Microsoft Teams allows you to make comments on basically any part of the platform, which makes it, again, really easy to contextualize some questions or information so you can put it right where it applies. Annotations too is a really nice feature on Microsoft Teams. Basically you can annotate files such as images or PDFs, which can provide more context and allow team members to collaborate more effectively. And then finally, you can search the chat history, which is really useful for providing context around previous conversations or decisions. Again, you have that really nice collected list of, basically the history, basically the history of the project and why it's important and what some of the main steps have been on it so far. Okay. So I know that we covered quite a bit of ground today. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or feel free to unmute if you have any other questions you'd like us to address.
Thank you for that information. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Bridget.
No, you're fine. I was going to just check with Dan to see if we had anything in the chat, but it doesn't seem like it.
Yeah, chat is still clear.
Okay.
Perfect. So you have mentioned, Bridget, that you guys do use Microsoft Teams?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
oh, sorry.
Are you able to use that also with individuals outside of your organization?
Yes, you can do that. You can bring in people from outside of your organization as guests. We found that most of our clients prefer to use Slack or some other kind of more simplified system, which is totally fine. But we do know that we have that option in case you want to basically loop people directly in our teams. We can do that. Yeah.
Right. And we can also share our documents with outside associates and outside contacts. Each folder can be shared and the permissions can be set a per contact basis, so that even within an individual project, you can share different folders with different contacts of your associated group.
Yeah, that's nice. And, I mean, again, we can share files in Slack, we can share files, basically anywhere through that system, as long as we've given, basically our collaborators access those files.
When you increase outside collaboration, does that impact the security of your system and your files at all?
That's a good question. I'm going to punt that one over to Dan, because I think he might have a better background on that.
Yeah, you have to consider security a lot more rigorously when you're allowing other individuals or other groups to gain access to your information. But a lot of that is, once again, it's part of that nebulousness of teams, in that you're just kind of expected to measure your own security decision as how every one of those particular activities applies. Teams is set up, actually Microsoft 365 as a system is set up so that there is a hierarchical structure as well, so that your administrator has significant control over, let's say, even the base question of whether anything can be shared to the outside. And then in cases where you are allowed to share to the outside, certain groups or certain people in certain roles are allowed to make certain decisions as to what gets shared to the outside. And then there is good documentation about it, so that if you happen to run the type of organization that submits to various outside audits, or even regulatory inspections and so on, that you can actually have documented evidence of how things are shared and what types of permissions are going along with that sharing activity, and even to whom various artifacts are shared. And so I think it would probably be a lot more strict if you are in some kind of heavily regulated industry. Like if you're in a bank, you probably wouldn't share any of your files with the outside world. But at the same time, if you're a design organization who has a few files for the customer to review, there's not really much danger in whether a PDF is opened, or whether a certain drawing happens to be opened by somebody at the customer's organization. So there's an entire spectrum of considerations of security and granular security capabilities. So it's really, like I said, part of the nebulousness of teams, in that it can be a disadvantage. And it's sort of like a monk used to say, it's a blessing and a curse.
Yeah, sounds like it. All right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions or comments, so I think that we are going to wrap it up. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today on this Thursday. I would also like to invite you tomorrow. We have another webinar at 11 o'clock. You can check our page, wyomingcommunitynavigator.org. We're going to be discussing how to get more leads and increase your sales. So join us tomorrow at 11 o'clock. I'd like to thank Daniel and Bridget for being here with us today. As usual, you guys provided us with so much content and a lot to think about and process. So thank you once again for taking your time to be here with us, and we really appreciate having you. So with that, thank you, everyone. I hope you all have a lovely Thursday, and I hope that we see you all again tomorrow. Have a great day. Bye.